hit like and subscribe. You're watching the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel.
Peace, family. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Thank you for watching Night School. Welcome to Night School. Every night here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, we hold Night School, where we break down the most interesting subjects, the most controversial topics, the most intense debates going on in the world today. And this week is no different. One thing that is different, of course, you know, is that I'm wearing my Philadelphia Eagles green. It's Kelly green because that's the old school Philadelphia Eagles colors. And yes, we did win the schmutz there. Sorry, it's a baby. We did win the Super Bowl, in case you didn't know, on Sunday night. And I got to shout out my city. I'm very proud and grateful that they won one and that Jalen Hurts was able to pull one out. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Tonight, we got a few things we want to talk about, but I'm very excited to jump into one of the lead stories, which is helping us make sense of sort of what this new global order is going to look like. We're going to talk about the potential end to the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. We're going to talk to about a Republican lawmaker who's potentially using a rape allegation to bring down a political opponent. There's other stuff we're going to cover as well, including some pop culture topics. But I want to help everyone sort of settle into these next 4 years of Donald Trump. You know, every night we're not going to do all Trump all the time, but it's pretty darn difficult to go even a few days without being outraged by what Trump presidency brings. It's very difficult to be unmoved by the committee, the assemblage of kind of rogue political figures, ideological extremists, you know, overt racists, morally indifferent figures that Donald Trump has put in front of us as the leadership team and core leadership team of the Trump presidency. And so it's hard to not cover this stuff. I wish I could ignore Trump, but I can't. I have no illusions that the Democrats would have been magical or extraordinary, or that they would have saved us from anything. They're all, anyway, that's another conversation for another time. But let's just say I'm not happy. I don't know if any outcome would have made me happy, but this outcome is one that I don't want to ignore. And the Donald Trump messiness continues. The Donald Trump extremeness continues. Forgive me, my brain's working a little bit slower today, y'all. It's been a rough couple of days, and I'm going to bring in my guest in just a moment. But I just want to, again, the next few days I'm on the road, I'm traveling, so we will have some changes in the night school schedule. But it's important to me that we continue to cover these things and that we continue to fight. So anyway, let's get to the top story of the night. Did Donald Trump just put white South Africans over struggling Black South Africans? In a shocking executive order, Donald Trump froze over $440 million in U.S. aid to South Africa overnight, claiming the Black-led government is discriminating. Discriminating against who, you might ask? Yes, discriminating against white landowners. Then Mr. Trump took it a step further. He slammed South Africa for taking Israel to court over genocide and even offered white South Africans refugee status in the United States. He offered white South Africans refugee status in the United States. Meanwhile, Black South Africans still fighting poverty, fighting disease, fighting land theft after apartheid. They're left with nothing. And get this. Donald Trump's biggest ally, you know him, Elon Musk, the billionaire, the uber billionaire, son of South African apartheid, descendant of Hitler apologists. He's backing Trump's move, while U.S. Black families get absolutely no protection as their land is stolen by corporations and gentrifiers and railroad companies, all of it. America once played a role in helping to end South African apartheid, after long being complicit, to be sure. But now Elon Musk is getting his revenge, and Donald Trump pushes the U.S. back toward a world very reminiscent of apartheid in South Africa, and that world is Jim Crow. We're seeing all of it here in the United States, and there has to be something we can do about it. But before we can do anything about it, we have to have a deep analysis about it, and that's what we do here at Night School. So let me bring in our next guest. He is somebody who you may know. He is a brilliant journalist. His name is Chris McGreal. He writes for The Guardian in the United States, and formerly he wrote for The Guardian in Jerusalem and Johannesburg, South Africa, toward the end of the apartheid period. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Mark.
Today, the world is acknowledging, celebrating the anniversary of Nelson Mandela being released from prison. It's been 35 years since the most wanted man in South Africa, the man who was on the terrorist watch list here in the United States, since he walked out of the prison free after being inside for 27 years. And he'd grown to be a kind of symbol of resistance, not just against the apartheid regime in particular, but against sort of injustice around the world. And much like Martin King, his ideologies have shifted, but more importantly, it seems like the world's understanding of him has shifted a bit. Talk to me about who Nelson Mandela is, who Nelson Mandela was, before we get into this other stuff, and what it means to South Africans at this point to think and talk about him.
Sure. I mean, Mandela became, as you say, he became the global symbol of the South African struggle against apartheid, and certainly the most recognizable figure outside of South Africa itself in that struggle. He was a lawyer who had been part of the kind of legal struggle against apartheid until the National Party, the Afrikaner-led National Party, which implemented apartheid after 1948, basically started to ban all kind of legal political challenges, resistance. And they banned the ANC, they banned the South African Communist Party, they banned a lot of other organizations. And that forced Mandela and the leadership of those organizations underground. So he goes on the run, and he and many other leaders are eventually caught, put on trial, initially for treason, but he's cleared of treason. But they get him on other charges, and they sentence him to life. Initially, there were those who were pushing for the death penalty against him, including the prosecutor Percy Utah. But they eventually pulled that, and he wasn't sent to death row. He wasn't obviously executed, and he spends the next 27 years in prison, increasingly becoming the face of that resistance to apartheid, at least within South Africa. There was an external leadership also carrying on the campaign. The thing about Mandela, I think, is in global terms, is that by the 1980s, he'd become this very big symbol. There was a birthday party for him, a huge concert in London in 1985. For, I think it must have been his 60th birthday at that point. And the growth, as you mentioned, the United States, in Europe and other places, the anti-apartheid resistance, the sanctions and all of that actually came out of popular movements. Governments, both the American government under Reagan, the Thatcher government in Britain, they essentially allied themselves with the apartheid regime and imposed almost no pressure on them at all. But the situation was shifted by ordinary people in the universities in America and Britain. Students stood up against apartheid, and it simply became impossible for the system to go on functioning. But at least internationally, and it became increasingly isolated. But the real resistance came within the country. There had, of course, been lots of resistance for a long time, but the real spark is the Soweto uprising in 1976, when on June 16th, the kids simply stop going to school. They come out the schools to protest against apartheid because the Afrikaner government is insisting that education be in Afrikaans rather than in English or in Black languages. And that, what seems like a small protest by school kids, is the spark. It sets everything off. And from then on, really, South Africa is never the same again. The country becomes ungovernable. In the 1980s, the white regime imposes states of emergency. And in 1990, eventually, it basically caves to the inevitable Mandela and negotiates a transition. 30 years later, I mean, it's 31 years nearly since since Mandela became president. There's a reassessment of that going on now, because whilst much did indeed change, and enormously for the better, and I think that almost no Black South African would say they'd rather go back to apartheid, the reality is that economically, a lot of people continue to struggle. They feel that Mandela made too many concessions, particularly a younger generation dealing with very high unemployment. And the reality is that the economic levers of the country remain largely in the hands of whites. Certainly, whites continue to live that privileged lifestyle, most of them. That was a hallmark of apartheid. And I think for lots of Black South Africans born since the end of apartheid, they're known as the born frees. They feel that not enough has changed, and that Mandela perhaps made too many compromises along the way.
And that's what makes things so fascinating. In a kind of post-apartheid world, I think much of the global community thought that there had been a reorganization, not just of political power, but of economic power, that there was a kind of equality in South Africa that simply didn't exist. It's like, yeah, you can be president, but can you own the land? You have access to the means of production, etc. That wasn't the case, as you pointed out. But that's what makes Donald Trump's decision so fascinating right now, or his declaration, the kind of claim that somehow white South Africans have been disenfranchised, or not disenfranchised, but that they've somehow been an injustice has been done to them. This idea that somehow it's very similar to what we talk about in the United States, sort of post-Civil War, that somehow, white Southerners were left behind, and it's unfair, and all these sort of legislative shifts and social changes have left the poor white man in a bad spot. And now you have these Afrikaners who are similarly framed this way by Trump. How do you make sense of that kind of analysis?
Yeah, it's a messy business. And one of the things I'll say up front is it's always worth looking at what Elon Musk's business interests are in all of these situations. And as you'll see, this comes to play a part. But what essentially you have is one of the reasons it should be said that the economics didn't change very much is that after the end of apartheid, you see Western governments, particularly the United States and Britain, essentially impose a neoliberal economic model on South Africa as a condition for aid. So genuine reform becomes actually very difficult. Nationalization of big industries isn't really possible. The mine owners continue to own the mines that exploited Black South Africans for so long to get rich. So you've got that mechanism, but you're right. 30 years later, one of the things that's going on is a rewriting of history, and Afrikaners, or some Afrikaners, it has to be said, not by any means at all, but a number of Afrikaners have kicked back against affirmative action in South Africa, black empowerment as it's known, about programs to uplift the majority who remain as we've been saying, remain in much more difficult circumstances than whites on the whole. They're kicking back at that in the way that we're seeing here now, people kicking back against DEI and programs to help people who've been previously disadvantaged. And I think one of the things that ways it's been played on here is that there's a very high crime rate in South Africa, and that includes a very high murder rate, and farmers have been being killed. White farmers have been being killed. That driven by Afrikaner nationalist groups and characterized as an assault on white farmers as they're being murdered for their land. And that plays partly on what happened in Zimbabwe 20 years ago, when Robert Mugabe unleashed the war veterans against white farmers there who were killed for their land as part of Mugabe's play to hang on to power. But what's happening in South Africa isn't at all analogous. There's a very high crime rate, and no farmers who've been killed have had their land taken away afterwards, or the people that killed them moved on to the land. That hasn't stopped groups. There's one particular group called AfriForum, which represents these Afrikaner nationalist interests, been lobbying very hard in the United States to portray Afrikaners as victims of basically the transition from apartheid and of crime. That they first caught Trump's attention back in 2018, actually, when they came here to lobby. They appeared on Tucker Carlson show on Fox News alleged that there was a white genocide in the making, and Trump saw that and then tweets his then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and says, we've got to pay attention to what's happening to these farmers in South Africa. And you can really trace the line all these years later to really the absolutely astonishing situation where, as you said, Trump is now saying the United States should offer political asylum to white South Africans, even as it's kind of no longer taking in, for instance, Afghan refugees who helped the United States military during the war there and who are genuinely at risk of being murdered for that. Yes, as we say, is a strange situation.
It boggles the mind. I mean, to what extent do you think that this is a legitimate concern or even expectation that people will take him up on the offer? Or is this simply a political ploy? Is this simply political theater? Is this something that Trump is just doing to signal once again to the pro-white nationalist base of his that he's on their side?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that Donald Trump thought this up all on his own. I mean, I don't think he's that in South Africa. He is surrounded by quite a lot of white South Africans. It's worth noting that these billionaires that are backed in, these tech billionaires like Peter Thiel, like David Sachs and others. David Sachs is, I believe now, his crypto and AI czar. These guys all at some point were raised in apartheid South Africa. They were born there or brought there as children. Were educated there. They're known as the PayPal mafia. And if you look at the original people at the top of PayPal, they were all white South Africans from the apartheid era. So he's been obviously influenced by that group of people. Yes, it does play to his base, as you say. It plays to this white nationalism that's here. But I think there's also something else going on, which is, as I mentioned, Musk's business interests, which are worth talking about because Musk has started in the past couple of years or so tweeting about potential white genocide in South Africa and the alleged that there are racist laws against white people there. And it comes at a time when he's trying to get his Starlink business into South Africa, his Starlink satellite business into South Africa. And he's run up against South Africa's black empowerment laws, which require that foreign investments in telecoms have at least a 30% local contingent of black local investment. And he doesn't want to do that. He says, this law is racist. Why should I have to give over part of my business to black empowerment? And I think Musk is using this and using Trump as a means of leveraging his way into South Africa without having to.
How? Help me make that connection. So he creates this discourse thing. People put the spotlight on, and people say, "Okay, fine. This is racist. This is awful. These poor white South African farmers." Even if he sparks that discourse here in the United States, and how does that shape or reshape his fortunes in South Africa? What is the linkage there?
Because the South African government's feeling this pressure. As you say, some aid has been cut off, particularly with HIV, AIDS medicines, PEPFAR. They're supposed to be exempt, but it turns out that clinics have been closing. But also, I think the South Africans feel they can just do without the grief of Donald Trump attacking them all the time. And the evidence of that is that the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, got onto Musk last week to try and talk the whole thing down. So I think the South Africans are feeling the pressure. There is a division inside the South African cabinet over how to deal with Musk. The Minister of Communications actually wants to cave to him and allow him to invest without the black empowerment element. Other people in the ANC object to this, say it sets a bad precedent, and there's no reason why Musk, particularly given his what many there regard as his racist views, they see no reason to indulge him. But I do think that, at least from Musk's perspective, this has been a factor in, what's come about. And I suspect that he's using this. What he's trying to do is tie up a lot of things together that aren't really tied together. So he's suggesting that the farm killings and the affirmative are tied to the affirmative action are tied to the fact that he has to do black empowerment, and he's trying to make out this is all the result of a racist government, a black racist government that's discriminating against whites. I think that's what's going on. I can't hear you.
Sorry, but that's the reason why the dots weren't connecting to me, is because it is somewhat convoluted logic. He's just hoping to throw enough mess against the wall to muddy the situation that people. It seems intentionally confusing, and ultimately, he's still just they're just orchestrating a kind of gun being placed to the head of the South African government.
Well, yes. I mean, although I think, it's not dissimilar to what's happening in this country, is it really? He's sent his people in, the Doge people into all these federal agencies. Nobody really knows what's going on or what really the end result is. But he's created an immense amount of chaos, has everybody on the back foot, questioning, fearful. And so I think it's not dissimilar to that. And, he's using Trump for that.
Yeah, I guess I could see that domestically. I'm surprised that the strategy is so effective with another government. But I mean, you've laid out why it is. I just hadn't thought about it before. You mentioned something about the PayPal mafia, and you even wrote an article in the Guardian, I believe, maybe like 3 weeks ago, that I thought was super interesting. Talk to me about who the PayPal mafia is. Like you said, people like Peter Thiel and others of sort of South African origin. But who exactly are they, and what role are they playing in potentially extending or reimposing apartheid in South Africa, if not legally, certainly in practice?
Well, Musk is certainly the most involved of them, and he's the one that lived in South Africa the longest. He was born in South Africa to a very, very strange family. His grandparents on his mother's side were actually Canadian Nazis, for all intents and purposes, who ran a fascist party in the 1930s, and then after the war liked the idea of the look of apartheid in South Africa and moved there in 1950. And even Elon Musk's father, Errol, says they were neo-Nazis and racists and great supporters of apartheid. So Musk grows up there. He goes to school in Johannesburg and Pretoria Boys High, which was a mostly white school. There were a few exceptions in which black pupils, students were allowed in, but it was essentially a segregated school. And he went in the 1980s, at that period when I was talking about, when there was incredible turmoil in South Africa. You had what was really a low-level civil war in some ways. There was plenty of political violence. There was certainly an air of revolution in the air, atmosphere of revolution in the air. And you had neo-Nazis, the Afrikaner resistance movement, which had a uniform modeled on a badge modeled on the Nazis, same colors and looked a bit like the swastika, marching in the streets. So that's Musk's upbringing there. But he lived in great style. His father was extremely rich. He owned emerald. He had investments in emerald mines in Zambia, and his father owned a jet and a yacht and several houses, and they lived a neo-colonial lifestyle with servants at their beck and call. Peter Thiel had a slightly different experience. He was born in Germany, but his father brought him to South Africa at a very young age. He went to school in Johannesburg, and then his father moved to what was then called Southwest Africa. It's now Namibia, the independent country of Namibia. But Southwest Africa in the 1970s was essentially a colony of South Africa and had the same apartheid system. His father worked at a uranium mine where just outside of a city called Swakopmund. And Swakopmund was a strange place because it was probably the last place on the earth where the Nazis were openly celebrated. There's an interesting New York Times article from about 1975 where the reporter describes pulling into a gas station to get his car filled, and the attendant greets him with a Hitler salute and Heil Hitler. And in those days, they still celebrated Hitler's birthday each May, and you could buy Nazi memorabilia and stuff in the curio shops. It was really quite open. And Thiel goes to school there. He says that the education was so brutal and his experience at that school was so brutal, which was German speaking, that it turned him into a libertarian. And then the other two players, who all of these people end up working together, founding PayPal, and at the top of PayPal, Musk and Thiel were the co-founders. You got David Sachs, who is another tech billionaire. He was born in Cape Town. His parents took him to Tennessee as a child, so he didn't have the full experience of growing up in South Africa, but he grew up in the white South African diaspora. And then there's a guy called Rolf Botha, who was the grandson of the last foreign minister under the apartheid regime, Pik Botha. And really, those four guys are, they're all extremely wealthy. Certainly, Thiel, Musk, and Sachs have been big funders of Trump. As I said, Sachs is Trump's AI czar. Thiel remains a big supporter of Trump, and clearly has access. And Musk, we know, is playing the role that he is at the head of Doge.
Which again is fascinating. I would not have imagined 4 years ago, or even maybe 12 months ago, that Elon Musk would be playing such an outsized role in the U.S. government in such an overt fashion. I mean, billionaires have always run the government, right, or at least have been influential in governments. But to see such an explicit and overt role being played is incredibly fascinating to me. This image that popped up earlier, of course, is the PayPal mafia. This was, I believe, Fortune magazine, if I remember correctly, a photo that they took, sort of playing into the narrative with the mafioso attire on. Very interesting here. Are we entering a new moment of control, do you believe, where the tech giants, the billionaire class, isn't just influential in the ways they've always been, but that they're going to take on more overt and explicitly sort of powerful roles in government? It's not just NGOs anymore. It's not just powerful whisperers. Now it's like, hey, I'm going to be in charge of the department of such and such. Next, we may have just Elon Musk or whomever is like the secretary of such and such. I mean, it feels like we're moving in that direction. Or is Trump an outlier, and this isn't the new norm?
I think it's really hard to know at the moment. I think my guess is certainly for Musk, that's where he would see the future. Yes, it's worth noting that the grandfather I was talking about headed something in Canada, which was the Canadian branch of a US movement called Technocracy Incorporated in the 1930s, which essentially tried to replace the elected government of FDR with technocrats, with businessmen who were going to run things because they didn't like the whole New Deal. And so, the grandfather very much bought into the idea that technocrats are much better at running governments than elected Democrats. And, you see signs of that similar thinking with Musk. I mean, his behavior, sending his minions into these various federal agencies with no accountability whatsoever. The idea that because he can find, some misuse of money here, that it justifies rolling roughshod over all kind of democratic norms and accountability and protections and all the things that actually, if he weren't in government, he would be complaining about the government doing, and saying it was overstepping its powers. I mean, this is one of the ironies of the present situation, is that you have a lot of these people who, particularly in the tech industry, that have complained for years about regulation and about the government having too much power, now kind of wading in and completely abusing that power against ordinary people. I suppose, where does it go? I don't know. I don't know that Musk even knows where it goes, let alone Trump. I do think there's a big question hangs over all of this, because we're only 3 weeks in, really, and obviously they've come at it with a lot of craziness, which I think is a way of destabilizing opposition. But I wonder, you do have to wonder how long Trump will put up with, for want of a better phrase, Musk kind of riding roughshod over everything, and almost overshadowing him. People, we're 3 weeks in and people are talking about Musk as though he's the one running the government, right?
Well, that's the other thing. There was a moment during the election cycle where it looked like Musk was almost a Trump fanboy. But since the election has happened, it seems almost the opposite. It seems as if Musk is the one sitting at the big desk making decisions and Trump has been relegated. There's a lot of ego there. There's a lot of power there. Can these two continue to have this bromance and play nicely? Or do you imagine that something has to give because of ego, because of power, because of maybe even competing aspirations?
Well, yeah, certainly the ego fact, I completely agree with you. I mean, you do have these two egos. I thought that the performance in the White House today in the Oval Office was interesting because there's Musk sort of standing there, essentially, doing all the talking. There are going to be consequences, and it's not clear what they are, but there's consequences to all of this. If one of the consequences may be that they're trying to get rid of quite a large number of civil servants, as you know, but the people that are going to leave aren't probably going to be their best people. So how well are things going to function a few weeks and months down the line when people are out the door? What happens when people don't start receiving their social security or whatever else may go wrong? I suspect at that point, Trump's going to look for somebody to blame, and Musk might be the person to take the rap because he's the one that's unleashed the chaos.
That certainly remains to be seen. Well, we appreciate you covering this for us. Thank you for your important work for a very long time. And hopefully we can talk to you again soon as things develop.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. Everybody, again, such an important moment, such an important topic. And I'm so glad that Chris is here to help us make sense of it. Let's continue to watch this. I know in the legacy or in the remembering of Nelson Mandela, we somehow ignore the complexity of who he was. And of course, we also often ignore the complexity of Winnie Mandela, who wasn't just his wife, but who was a fellow political strategist, fellow political analyst. And although they did not remain together after he exited prison, she still plays a significant part of his history. And so I want to make sure that we're always having those conversations simultaneously. Nelson Mandela's legacy is one that begins with a kind of nonviolent strategy, but eventually developed into a different strategy when he recognized what he was up against, when he recognized the violence, the relentless violence of his political enemies, his political opponents. So I think it's important when we think about the legacy of Nelson Mandela to also think about what it means to use nonviolence as a tactic rather than just an overall strategy, to have nonviolence as an approach as opposed to a life philosophy. There are many ways to approach political resistance and political victories. And oftentimes here in the United States, we sort of fetishize Kingian nonviolence when in fact there are many other ways to think about resistance. And I'm not telling you which one to do. I'm just saying that I think it's important to complicate our understanding of what victory looks like here in the United States, particularly people of color. Unless they're deploying Gandhian or Kingian nonviolence, they're seen as rogues. They're seen as morally improper. They're seen as people who are operating outside the ethical norms. But in fact, no one or few people are successful at achieving a kind of political sovereignty through nonviolence. So that's another thing. The other thing that I think about when we talk about the Mandela legacy, and the thing that I've always found really valuable, is that when Nelson Mandela walks out of that prison, the first thing he does is re-register his membership to the ANC. I mean, can you imagine spending decades in prison? He could have retired. He could have written books. He could have stayed in his house. But he felt the need to rejoin his party. He felt the need to be recommitted to the struggle. Prison didn't strip him of his radicality. It may have added some pragmatism. It may have changed his approach, as did time. But Nelson Mandela remained committed to struggle and the liberation of his people, even after being caged in the dungeons of South African prisons for decades. I think that that's a testament to his extraordinary courage, his extraordinary abilities, and his remarkable capacity to grow and to change and to develop. as a political leader, as a political strategist, and as a freedom fighter. Nelson Mandela is one of my heroes for all of those reasons. And you know, that's why this Trump story is so disturbing to me, particularly on this day. I'm not shocked that Donald Trump is backing white South African farmers, particularly Elon Musk whispering in his ear. And it's not that I think that, you know, Elon Musk is, you know, the bad kid in school that makes Donald Trump bad. I think Donald Trump is sufficiently bad on his own. I just don't think he has a global worldview. I don't think Donald Trump knows enough about South African history or politics to have a point of view at all on it without Elon Musk. But we saw this with Trump in his previous administration. He is a kind of open town in a time of war. He's someone who, you know, if you can get his influence, if you can get his ear, if you can play to his ego, you can get him to do a lot of things, because Donald Trump isn't driven by ideology in the same way. There are concrete goals that Donald Trump has. I said last time, there are some people who want to change the world. There's some people who want to run the world. Donald Trump absolutely wants to run the world. And to do that, he is willing to have anybody from John Bolton, who we saw at one point, you know, the warmonger, who John Bolton, as Trump even said, it never found a war that he didn't want to be involved in, to other folk who are saying, hey, let's pull back from the global kind of geopolitical landscape to the extent that we're going to be more isolationist. All of it is fine with Trump as long as he gets to run the world. I think there's a way that could be potentially beneficial if you have the right people in your ear. But when you got Elon Musk in your ear, and Pamela Jones here from the classroom writes in and says, Trump is a malignant, narcissistic opportunist. Yeah, I mean, like if that's his deal, it does make it a bit challenging to do anything else. Anyway, let's move on to another story. A black family in Georgia just lost their land to a white-owned railroad company, and they say it's straight up theft. For nearly 2 years, Blaine and Diane Smith have been fighting to keep 600 acres of land that their grandfather bought in the 1920s. But last week, a Georgia judge ruled in favor of Sandersville Railroad, allowing them to seize the land under eminent domain. This land fed generations. It paid for college. It built black wealth. And now a 4.5 about a 4.5 mile rail line is going to be cutting through their property, disrupting the homes, putting the community at risk for pollution, and also allowing trespassers, essentially creating another state-sanctioned cancer row. But the Smiths are not backing down. They're taking their fight to the Georgia Supreme Court. They have basically said, we're not going to let another black family get removed off the land. This is an important story that we're going to continue to follow. Hopefully next week I can get Blaine and Diane on Night School so we can talk about this in depth. But I want to put this story on your radar, that the courts are right now siding with a railroad company to further dispossess a black family from, you know, a generationally owned property. This is something that we find disturbing. This is something that we want to cover. This is something that we care about. This is something that you should care about. I find these stories to be happening more and more, particularly in the South. I feel like it's almost a moment where people just either aren't paying attention, or the courts believe people aren't paying attention. And without the global outcry, without the, or at least the national outcry, without the organizing actions around it, we're seeing people routinely dispossessed. And because the courts have been packed with conservatives, not just in states like Georgia, but in states that are typically more generous with this, the people are not winning. That's all I can tell you. All right. Donald Trump just said that the United States is going to be taking control of Gaza, whether the world likes it or not. Sitting next to Jordan's King Abdullah at the White House on Tuesday, Trump doubled down on his plan to forcibly remove millions, almost 2 million Palestinians, and relocate them to Jordan and Egypt, even if Jordan and Egypt don't want those people. And if they don't take them, because that's the question, right? Well, how are you going to make Jordan and Egypt take people who they don't want? And to be clear, Jordan and Egypt don't disapprove of the idea because they hate Palestinians, which is the right-wing narrative and the Zionist narrative. They don't want them because they know that it's an injustice, and that it will be allowing Nakba 2.0. It will be allowing another catastrophe by allowing Palestinians to be ethnically cleansed out of Gaza. So Egypt and Jordan said no. And you know what Trump said? Well, if you don't do it, we're going to take your aid. Literally, he said, we're going to take it. We're going to hold it. We're going to cherish it. he even claimed that Gaza could be a, quote, diamond under U.S. control. Again, Jordan, Egypt, they ain't having it. They call it an illegal land grab, and they said it violates international law, because of course it does. You can't acquire land through force like this. And the UN has weighed in as well. They said that this is what forced displacement, which is also called ethnic cleansing. And King Abdullah told Trump that they should wait for Egypt's plan, which could involve a Palestinian-led local government without Hamas, one that would be backed by Arab states, one that would be the alternative to a Trump plan. But Donald Trump says, nope, I don't care. Since first announcing his plan with Netanyahu, he's only doubled down, saying the U.S. is, quote, committed to buying and owning Gaza. In a Fox News interview, he made it clear Gaza's 2 million residents will be removed and have no right to return. Trump said, quote, they wouldn't because they have much better housing. I'm talking about building a permanent place for them. Question is, you know what? There's so many things I want to say about this, but I'm going to keep it simple tonight because I've said this. First, this is morally repugnant. Where are all the members of Congress to speak out against this, Democrat and Republican? Where are the courageous voices now? Where are the people to say this is a violation of international law? You didn't speak out on October 7th, and you had the defense of saying, well, Israel was attacked, we have to stand with Israel. What are you going to say now that Donald Trump is talking about annexing Gaza? Now that he's talking about ethnically cleansing Gaza, there is no morally defensible reason. There's no legal reason, legally justifiable reason for this. How are y'all just allowing this to happen? Please explain to me how you're allowing this to happen. But you're not hearing anything. The Republicans and the Democrats, I've heard Democrats say, maybe, oh, this will never happen. Okay, saying this will never happen, which I happen to agree with, because I think the Palestinians and the Arab world will resist. But it's not enough to say it'll never happen. Can you imagine if Donald Trump proposed, oh, we should put black people in slavery, and all the Democrats say this, oh, he'll never catch them. I'm like, what? That's not enough. We need a repudiation. We need some kind of speech about this. Also, this is what I was trying to tell you about Donald Trump. Again, if you didn't vote for Kamala, fine, I don't care. If you voted for whoever, I don't care. This isn't about who you voted for. But during the election time, some of you were trying to say that Donald Trump would be better on Gaza. That Donald Trump would be good on Gaza, even. And so people stop paying attention or applying pressure. Listen to me. Again, this ain't about the Democrats. This is about saying Donald Trump is awful on Gaza. He was always awful on Gaza, and now he's worse. Cutting UNRWA, bad. Moving the embassy, bad. But now he's talking about literally forcing the world to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And he's saying it in full public view. This is something that the Israeli right has wanted to do, and frankly, the Israeli middle has wanted to do for a very long time. But always covertly. But now there's not even a pretense of pushback. So what do you do now? What do you do now? So much more to be said, but this is, again, repugnant. I don't believe that this will happen. Could it happen? Yes. But I don't believe it will. But it's not going to not happen because of magic. It's going to not happen if the people stand up. So please push your members of Congress to do something. Please push your political voices, your political advocates, your political activists, your political organizers to say and do something. It's not enough to sit on your hands right now, because to do that is to say that ethnic cleansing is okay. The ethnic cleansing is not an outrage. If you were outraged about what was happening on October 7th, continue to be outraged. If you were not, because you played into these narratives that the Palestinians deserve whatever happened to them because for 15 months because of October 7th, which is absurd. What are you going to say now? What are you going to say now? If you say international law is fuzzy about self-defense, well, it wasn't, and it isn't. But what you going to say about this? International law is crystal clear about taking people's land. people say wars have consequences. No, that's not a justifiable excuse for this. What are you talking about? Anyway, let's move on to one more story before I go, man, because I am frustrated, to say the least. The ceasefire might be over by Saturday. And Benjamin Netanyahu, surprise, is ready to go back to war. Hamas says that Israel broke the deal, killing 92 Palestinians since the truce began, also blocking aid and stopping displaced people from returning to their homes. And now they're refusing to release more hostages until Israel follows the agreement. Israel is calling foul. They're saying Hamas's delay is a complete violation of the deal. So each side is pointing fingers that the other violated the deal. Netanyahu says that if Hamas doesn't hand over hostages by noon on Saturday, the IDF will restart full-blown attacks until Hamas is, quote, completely defeated. And we know that that is just code for continuing to blow up the Gaza Strip and killing innocent people. Trump, who helped broker the ceasefire, wants to scrap the whole thing anyway and saying that Hamas should be given one final ultimatum: release everyone or else. Again, this is what I was telling y'all when Biden was prosecuting this genocide, which he was, and Trump said he would do the same thing. He would just finish the job. This is what I was telling y'all. They're both equally bad on this. Meanwhile, Qatar and Egypt and the UN, they're trying to hold this fragile coalition together, but Israel is already gearing up for another round of war. The military just increased its readiness in southern Israel. They also reinforced the border. Trump gave Netanyahu the green light to, quote, let all hell break out by noon on Saturday if the hostages are not returned. Look, it is obvious to me, based on the evidence, that Israel has broken the ceasefire multiple times, killing Palestinians, blocking aid, and stopping people from returning to their homes. These are all violations of the deal. And so Hamas is saying, look, follow the agreement and we'll give you more hostages. Israel is not doing that. I don't know what the right answer here is. This is a very complicated situation, because even if Hamas is 100% right, what do you do? Do you allow more Palestinians to die? Do you hold your ground, or do you say, look, Israel's just looking for an excuse to continue to blow us off the map anyway, and so we have to hold the line here. You know, I'm not saying that Hamas is right. I'm not saying Hamas is wrong here. I'm not saying what the right answer is, because I honestly don't know. I'd love to talk to some military strategists about this. I'd love to talk to some Palestinian leaders about this, to get to think through this in a few different ways. But this is complicated. But what I know for sure is that the root of this, absolutely, indisputably, is that Israel has never followed the ceasefire deal. They have repeatedly broken the ceasefire deal from the day that it was signed. The question to me is not, is Israel violating the deal? The question to me is, what is the most strategically wise way to respond to this? And I don't have an answer, but I think there are much smarter people than me who do. And so again, let's hopefully in the next day or two talk to some Palestinian leadership to get a sense of what makes the most strategic sense in light of this reality. Anyway, family, I want to thank y'all for watching Night School tonight. We're going to cover some more stuff. In fact, I'm going to come back later tonight to talk some domestic politics. We want to do a special live tonight on Nancy Mace and all of the stuff that comes along with her, as well as some pop culture stuff. In the meantime, family, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you're so inclined, please hit the join button. That's how we say it's financially strong on this channel. We need people to hit the join button. We need people to become monthly paid members of the channel. When you do that, you give us the financial stability we need to do the work that we do every single night. Also, if you don't want to make a monthly commitment, you can make a one-time commitment. Go to Cash App, go to Venmo, go to Zelle, go to one of these platforms and drop something. You can drop $1. I'm grateful. You can drop $1 million. I'll be really grateful. Anything in between, I'll be grateful. It keeps us going. Think about it as a kind of tuition payment for the month. But we do have a goal. I'd love it if every person watching tonight could make a $10 donation. $10, which will cover you for the month, for all the content we do: Night School, Office Hours, Coffee and Books, all of it. Classroom in the Cell, $10. Please consider it. Again, if you don't have $10, you can drop $1. You can drop $2. You can drop $5. And again, you can drop $1 million. But if everybody watching right now were to drop $10 on average, we would meet our monthly financial goals. And I want to give an extra special shout out to Robin Walker Murphy, who gifted 20 MLH memberships, 20 memberships she gifted. Thank you so much. You have no idea how grateful I am. Thank you, Robin Walker Murphy. Love you, appreciate you. Everybody else, thank you for watching the show. I'll see you later.